History as it happens, June 17th, 2021. America and Russia, where it all went wrong.
This is about practical, straightforward, no-nonsense decisions that we have to make or not make. We'll find out within the next 6 months to a year whether or not we actually have a strategic dialogue that matters.
One summit between Biden and Putin can't resolve 30 years of missteps, miscalculations, and meddling by both nations. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the future was filled with hope. So what happened, and what might be done? That's next, as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Mr. General Secretary, there is a saying in your country that a poor peace is better than a good quarrel.
Governor Romney, I'm glad that you recognize that al-Qaeda is a threat, because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia.
They think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this, I don't see any reason why it would be.
Let's get this straight. How would it be if the United States were viewed by the rest of the world as interfering with the elections directly of other countries, and everybody knew it?
Hate to break it to Mr. Biden, but, maybe we'll cover the history of the CIA in another episode. So, Christmas Day 1991, President George Bush delivered a nationally televised address signaling a new era in international relations was about to begin.
This is a day of great hope for all Americans. Our enemies have become our partners, committed to building democratic and civil societies. They ask for our support, and we will give it to them. We will do it because as Americans, we can do no less.
The Soviet Union suddenly was gone. The nation Ronald Reagan in 1983 called an evil empire collapsed. Democracy and capitalism would come to Russia and the former Soviet republics, too. And there'd be peace and cooperation between the world's superpowers. Looking back on those hopes and dreams of 30 years ago makes you ask, what happened?
Well, as far as Russia is concerned, I saw no reason why those relations should not be excellent. There didn't seem to be any significant geopolitical issues anymore dividing the two countries.
Anatol Lieven of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft is our guest today. We're going to get into the reasons why George Bush's New World Order was stillborn, but also how the U.S. and Russia might end their counterproductive confrontations and start working together to deal with the world's problems. Now, the summit in Geneva was not enough, of course, but it could be a start. Remember, Ronald Reagan held 5 face-to-face meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev as the two leaders changed the way they talked about one another and de-escalated the Cold War.
It should provide us with a challenge, an opportunity to move from confrontation toward cooperation.
That was in Washington in 1987, and diplomacy continued under President Bush, leading to a historic treaty in 1990 on arms reduction. But 31 years later, Russia is led by an authoritarian leader accused of murdering his political opponents and meddling in our elections, among other things. From Moscow's point of view, the U.S. and NATO are encroaching on vital Russian interests by having expanded the borders of the Western military alliance hundreds of miles eastward since the end of the Cold War. And this encroachment, arguably more than anything else, has ruined relations between the two nations. And it provoked Russia's annexation of Crimea and invasion of Ukraine in 2014, so the argument goes. So before we proceed, I'm going to let you know that because of our production schedule, we recorded our conversation with Anatol Lieven before the summit took place. So we shall leave the analysis of what was said in Geneva to others. Our focus today is on how we got to this point and where the U.S. and Russia might go next, because it'll take time and real effort to reverse decades of bad moves. Our guest has a remarkable background, having covered the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the wars in Afghanistan, Chechnya, and the Southern Caucasus. He's written a number of books about Russia and its neighbors. His most recent book is Climate Change and the Nation State. And now he's a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Joining us from Qatar, Anatol Lieven, welcome.
Hello.
So you were there in Eastern Europe covering the collapse of communism and the fall of the USSR. What did you think were the possibilities for a post-Cold War relationship with the United States at that historic moment?
Well, as far as Russia is concerned, I saw no reason why those relations should not be excellent. There didn't seem to be any significant geopolitical issues anymore dividing the two countries. Communism, thank God, had disappeared, and so there was no longer an ideological threat from what became Russia to America. And of course, historically speaking, there had never been disputes or conflicts between Russia and America. Obviously, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and America was because of the Soviet Union's megalomaniac communist ambitions to spread communism to the whole world, which obviously the United States had to resist and roll back. But with communism gone and Russia back as a Russian nation state, I simply couldn't see why Russia and the USA should come into conflict. And I could see many areas where they could cooperate, including on stabilizing the Middle East. The problem was, I think, that Russia rapidly became extremely weak, corrupt, divided, ineffective, which gave the United States the feeling that it could do anything. And of course, you then had this American ambition basically to exercise hegemony over the entire world, as drawn up by Wolfowitz and Scooter Libby in 1992. And really, I mean, every subsequent American administration has basically followed that policy. Well, that was bound to bring America into serious tension with Russia as soon as Russia recovered. And I always thought that Russia would, to some degree, recover, given its immense internal resources. And then, I mean, obviously, Russia was going to resent and resist America trying to take over what had been for many centuries part of the Russian Empire. And that has led us to the present miserable position.
So you said Russia would eventually recover. You're referring to the economic catastrophe of the transition to capitalism, and politically, the failure of Yeltsin and the rise of Putin. It seems that Russian nationalism asserted itself. To what extent did that contribute to this antagonistic relationship with the West?
Yes. The lack of democracy in Russia, and remember, I mean, Russia in the 1990s was in no sense a real democracy. Yeltsin rigged the elections, his cronies stole the economy. He launched the first very brutal war in Chechnya, which I covered. Of course, under Putin, Russia has become much more authoritarian. Obviously, Putin's repression has turned many people in the United States against the Putin regime and against Russia. But I have to say that when it comes to questions like Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO, America backing these countries in territorial disputes with Russia, America promising to take Ukraine into NATO and basically Ukrainianizing the Russian minority in Ukraine and expelling the Russian fleet from its base in Sevastopol. Russian resistance to this is not because of Putin's authoritarianism. Any Russian government of any political stripe, democratic, liberal, communist, nationalist, all of them would have to resist this in the name of vital Russian national interests. And as I often say, no matter how the population of Hawaii voted, and no matter what the situation under international law was, I do not think you would see America agreeing to give up Pearl Harbor.
So you mentioned NATO there. After the Cold War, some European leaders did question whether NATO should continue on as it had. But to your point, the U.S. made sure that NATO would not only continue to exist, but expand eastward. So that seems to be a big part of the problem here.
Yes. I was never against the continuation of NATO, as the ultimate backstop of security for Western Europe, which is obviously also a vital American interest. I didn't see why it needed to expand. And above all, I knew from the very start that if it tried to expand into Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, there would be very serious trouble because Russia is implacably opposed to this. And it should be noted, I mean, Russia protested, of course, because Russia was verbally promised that NATO would not expand. So when NATO expanded to Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary, Russia protested, but it didn't, threaten anything. It didn't take, any action against this, because after all, the Soviet Union, Moscow had allowed all these countries to go in 1989, and Russia has no ambition to dominate them again. Russia became more anxious, of course, with the Baltic states getting into NATO, because that brings it much, much closer to Russia. But in the case of Ukraine and Georgia, where there are territorial disputes with Russia, there Russia always made clear from the very start that Russia would do everything necessary to prevent this, including, if necessary, the use of force. So nobody in the West had any business being surprised when this is what Russia did in 2008 in Georgia and 2014 in Ukraine. Russia regards these regions as simply vital to it, in the same way that the United States regards Central America as vital to American security. I don't condemn America for that. You can condemn some of the specific actions that America has taken in Central America, just as you can condemn some of the specific actions that Russia has taken. But it is simply a fact of history and geopolitics that great powers will seek to maintain friendly governments, friendly states on their borders. Every sensible statesman or stateswoman should know that and act accordingly.
So it seems over the past 3 decades there has been this misunderstanding. When the United States views Russian moves as aggressive, Russia is basically doing what it believes are defensive moves.
Yes, exactly. You've gone to the very core of the problem. And of course, there's right and wrong on both sides. But, NATO and the West have expanded eastwards by hundreds of miles since 1989. Russia has retreated and retreated. I really don't think that historians 200 years from now, if there are any, will simply regard Russia as the aggressor in this situation.
So over the past 3 decades, most new U.S. presidents have hoped to reset the relationship with Russia, but it's never really worked. Why is that?
Because America has to be prepared to make certain concessions. America has to be prepared to compromise. After 9/11, Putin really reached out to the United States, offering close cooperation in Afghanistan and against Islamist terrorism, from which Russia had suffered terribly. He basically promised to do everything America wanted Russia to do in the Middle East. He would have been prepared to go along with the Iraq War. There was just one condition: do not expand NATO and the European Union to Ukraine and Georgia. We don't want to take these countries back, he said, into anything like the Soviet Union. That's completely impossible. He said himself that anyone who thinks the Soviet Union can be restored has no brain. But he did want to make sure that no potentially hostile Western alliance, moved up to Russia's borders. But America has never been prepared to agree to that, even after NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine have become manifestly impossible. And of course, as long as America won't make concessions to vital Russian interests, Russia will not cooperate in other areas where its own interests are not closely engaged.
What are those other areas?
In the Middle East, principally. Putin now has actually very friendly relations with Netanyahu. Russia, recognizes Israel, has not come out behind the Palestinians, but Russia wants to maintain a certain influence, wants to defend old allies. But above all, in Syria, the Russians are often quite bewildered about American behavior there, because the Russians say, look, we both have a vital interest in combating ISIS and Sunni Islamist terrorism and Al-Qaeda. If you overthrow the Syrian state, you know that you won't be able to put anything effective in its place. And that means that you must know that there will be massive new opportunities for ISIS and for Islamist terrorism, using it as a base. Why can't you see that and work with us, to stabilize Syria again? Sure, the Syrian government is vile, but then, look, let's be honest, America has backed some pretty vile governments in its time, including in the Middle East. Why are we at odds over Syria? The Russians actually don't get it to a considerable extent. And then in Afghanistan, America and Russia, now that America is withdrawing, basically have identical interests. They both recognize that the Taliban will have a major share of power. Neither of them want the Taliban to have total power. And above all, America and Russia both really fear Afghanistan becoming a base for ISIS and for international terrorism again. There should be ample room for cooperation. I hope that Biden and Putin have done something to put that in place at the summit.
And I'll just remind our listeners that we recorded this conversation prior to the summit in Geneva. So over the past 5 years, a lot has been made in the U.S. press, to say the least, about how Russia meddled in the 2016 election. Do Russian leaders believe the United States meddles in their internal affairs, and how so?
Oh, absolutely. From the Russian point of view, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the National Endowment for Democracy, all of them congressionally funded, these are agencies of the American state, basically, have for many years now run unrelenting propaganda against the Putin regime and have, repeatedly given platforms to the Russian opposition in order to condemn and attack Putin. Now, of course, there are many good reasons for this. There are many really terrible aspects to the Putin regime, no question. But let's face facts. If you make clear your desire to bring down a foreign government, that foreign government is not going to be friendly with you and is going to retaliate. Remember that, until basically the 2014 crisis in Ukraine, there was no attempt by Russia to influence American internal politics. The Russians didn't think of it, that the Russians were really not trying to subvert America. So once again, this is realism. If you try to bring down a foreign state, and remember that many Russians think that America is not just trying to bring down Putin, that America is really trying to weaken, divide Russia, that there will be a reaction against it.
And you mentioned before, some of this has nothing to do with Putin himself. Any nation will respond defensively to impingements on its sovereignty.
Yes, and of course, a great many Russians, like a great many Iranians and a great many Chinese, who do not like their existing regimes. I know many, many Russians who detest Putin, but who equally really, do not like America interfering in Russia. And also, this is something which people in Washington, I think, really need to remember, do not like Russian opposition figures being supported by America and playing to the American gallery, if only because, of course, this allows Putin to present, and the Iranian regime and the Chinese regime, to present these people as American agents and traitors. American support for dissidents in other countries, at least in other countries where the mass of the population has a very strong nationalism. It's different, of course, where that nationalism is on America's side, like in Poland in the past. But where the nationalism of countries, is in many ways opposed to the United States, for political figures to line up with America is completely disastrous. So, I often say, just imagine in the United States if a leading politician openly aligned themselves, even with a friendly foreign power. I don't know if you recall, back in the 2004 elections, the Guardian in Britain, this liberal newspaper, decided to bombard certain counties in Ohio, a critical swing state and critical swing counties, with propaganda against George Bush and in favor of John Kerry. Well, you can imagine what happened. The vote for Bush shot up because Americans really don't like foreigners lecturing them. Well, nor do Russians. It ain't rocket science.
Yeah, I do not remember that about The Guardian, but we should keep in mind that when it comes to meddling in the affairs of other countries, the United States does not have a good track record. The history of the CIA is not a good one. So when it comes to this summit in Geneva, your advice, so to speak, to President Biden, and moving forward from here as well, is to tone down the confrontational rhetoric, right?
Yes, I mean, you can make statements, setting out America's basic positions, of course, why not? But since everybody knows those positions, and since Biden has established himself rhetorically very strongly as a critic of Putin and Russia, From the point of view of America's international relations, there's really no need to shout and beat the drum over this. Of course, unfortunately, there may be a reason to do that for domestic politics. But if Biden could, and in future the Biden administration could shout less and could begin, not with the contentious issues. Look, in any human relationship, if you want to get certain things, you don't begin with the areas on which you bitterly disagree. You begin with the areas on which you could actually agree. And there is a lot of room for cooperation on Afghanistan. There's a lot of room for restoring the very useful intelligence cooperation against Islamist terrorism that used to exist between America and Russia. There's room for mutual reductions in nuclear arms, of which both countries have far, far more than they need for a credible deterrent. And then, having started with the easy stuff, you can then move on to the stuff that is undoubtedly very difficult, but where in the long run, agreement is really necessary, and you can start to put certain building blocks in place without being naive, or optimistic about any early agreement. But there are things one can start working on towards eventually a treaty on cyberspace, outlawing cybercrime and cyber sabotage.
Yeah, I'd like to get into the malware issue here. This has been blamed on Russia. I do want to return to Biden and his worldview and where Europe falls into all of this. Since you brought up cyber warfare, is Russia responsible for some of these attacks on American infrastructure, or actors inside Russia who are protected by its government?
When it comes to attacks on infrastructure, the Russian state forces do not appear to have been involved. Russian criminal groups, undoubtedly. The problem, I think, is that, of course, one has no proof of this, but it does seem very plausible that the Russian security forces have used criminal groups as agents in the past. And therefore, it's very difficult for them now to crack down on these groups. But of course, that has also been true of the CIA in the past in a different context. On America's side, of course, it's difficult for America to come out completely publicly, though everybody knows, it's hardly been denied, that America has carried out cyber sabotage operations against Iran, for example. One of the things which the two sides do need to work towards, I think, is a mutual recognition that spying, cyber spying, is in a different category. Everybody does it. America has done it to American allies in Europe, to Germany.
That was under Obama, correct?
Yes, but and look, that's why we have spies. That's what spies do, right? It's what they're paid for. But spying, is a very different matter from sabotage. The Soviets spied on America throughout the Cold War, and America spied on the Soviet Union. But by God, if the Soviets had started blowing up American infrastructure, or America had done that in the Soviet Union, we would have been in World War III, right? You've got to draw a distinction between espionage and sabotage. Now, that's very difficult to do in cyberspace because, of course, one can very easily blur into the other. But I think that's one of the things that America and Russia and China and other countries have to work towards. It's very difficult, but it's essential, because otherwise we won't get anywhere. There'll be constant overreactions to espionage. And meanwhile, the criminals will continue to operate in a free space, unregulated by effective international law and action.
Cyber warfare in the 21st century challenges our very conception of war. 100 years ago, if you wanted to take out someone's pipeline, you would fly hundreds of bombers and you'd saturate, carpet bomb an area to blow up a pipeline or a dock or a factory. Today, it's done bloodlessly, but the effects are just as devastating. If, for instance, you can, as happened, turn off a pipeline that feeds the entire East Coast its gasoline.
Yes, indeed. And that is why we need really effective international action against these criminals, and also a really effective ban on cyber sabotage by states. But from that point of view, it doesn't help when US politicians like Senator Dodds and Representative Pelosi describe cyber spying operations, espionage, as if they were Pearl Harbor. They're not. Everybody does it. To begin any productive process over this, it would be a good idea to begin by toning down the rhetoric.
So back to Joseph Biden, first elected to the Senate in 1972. He's a believer in internationalism. I saw him described in an article today as an Atlanticist, a supporter of the post-World War II order in Europe, a supporter of NATO. But what do you think of this passage from the New York Times today? The transatlantic partnership has always been less reciprocal than its champions like to pretend. Again, reading from an article in the Times, a marriage in which one partner, the United States, carried the nuclear umbrella. Now, with China replacing the Soviet Union as America's arch rival, the two sides are less united than they were during the Cold War, a geopolitical shift that lays bare long-standing stresses between them. So we've been talking about the U.S. and Russia and Biden and Putin, but Europe and American interests aren't totally in alignment here when it comes to dealing with, one, Russia, and two, China.
Well, on Russia, some of the Europeans, the Germans in particular, do remember that they share a continent with Russia. Russia is not going to go away. And there is, of course, all this language about Europe whole and free, excluding Russia, but that is ridiculous. Russia is a large part of the European continent. And ultimately, you have to be able to obviously resist Russia in certain ways, but also work with Russia. I think that's often forgotten in America because, of course, America is 3,000 or so miles further away across the Atlantic. On China, of course, the Europeans, they haven't had a major stake in the Far East since the fall of the European empires 3 generations ago now. They do not regard themselves in any way as directly physically threatened by China. So, and of course, as the United States too, they have vital economic links with China, especially the Germans. So the Europeans have shown a willingness to push back against China in certain areas over human rights in Xinjiang, over Huawei and 5G, over aspects of China's infrastructure ambitions in Europe. But there is a great deal of resistance to following the United States into full confrontation with China, and a lot of unwillingness, even in Britain, which of course is the most pro-American of the large European states, an unwillingness to launch or join in or acquiesce in a new Cold War with China. Of course, there are more and more concerns about China, but still people would prefer to maintain some sort of cooperative relationship. And on that, of course, I quoted in a recent article a European minister who said that Europe is a political dwarf, a military worm, but an economic giant. And, repeatedly American leaders have found, the Europeans have gone along with them, with America, on all sorts of things until it comes to a question of European money. And then, surprise, surprise, the Europeans become much tougher. And I think that's what we're seeing also in the US-European relationship over China. Oh, and the Germans, of course, also the Nord Stream pipeline with Russia. The Germans have become much more anti-Russian in recent years. But when it was a question of a pipeline in which the Germans had invested a great deal of money and which they regard as vital to their energy security, well, very politely, but Germany told America to get lost.
We also have to remember the ways in which the world has changed. U.S. influence, U.S. hegemony has waned, largely because of the way the U.S. prosecuted the war on terrorism by torturing prisoners, extraordinary rendition, preemptive unilateral actions in the Middle East. This is not the same world as it was when he was Senator Biden.
Well, that's true. And look, to speak cynically, European governments might have turned a blind eye or at least made only token protests over torture and so on, something they have engaged in themselves in the past. But The real problem was failure. The US intervention in Iraq was a disaster, which gave birth to ISIS. The American, and it must be said, European intervention in Libya was a disaster, which has spread Islamist extremism and unemployed mercenaries, across a third of Africa.
And a refugee crisis in Europe.
Indeed, and has opened the way for a massive flood of refugees into Europe, which is really destabilizing European democracy. And it's worth pointing out on this that Russia was against all these operations, and Russia was right. And it was right not just from Russia's point of view, it was right from America's point of view as well. America would be, as you said, in a vastly better situation today if it hadn't done any of these things. But also, there is simply the fact of brute economic power. Back in the 1970s, the G7, in other words, America and its democratic allies, including Japan, represented 80% of global GDP. Now, if you represent 80% of global GDP, you can get a great many things done if you put your mind to it. Now, today, the whole of the G7 put together only accounts for 40% of global GDP. At that point, your influence, like it or not, is going to be a great deal less.
So we began this discussion by reflecting upon the optimism at the end of the Cold War. In the West, the hope that Russia could become more integrated with Western Europe. That seems like a tall order right now. So what are the keys to beginning a better relationship between the two countries and ending some of the antagonism?
It would be a tremendous help if Russia could become more democratic. I'm not optimistic about that. I would very much like it to happen. But it must be recognized that any Russian state would simply have to resist the military encroachment of NATO and the United States on its borders, just as any American administration, whether Republican or Democratic, would have to resist the appearance of a potentially hostile alliance in Central America. That is just it's a fact. So for there to be a more productive relationship, I hope deeply that Russia will become more democratic, but America and the West will also have to scale back their ambitions and recognize that Russia and other countries as well have legitimate interests of their own in other countries. If you don't respect those legitimate and vital interests, you will not get a productive relationship with those countries.
Anatol Lieven of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Your observations are important as we try to see the world from perspectives other than our own. On the next episode of History as It Happens, it's the 80th anniversary of the biggest, most barbaric battle ever fought. And that is the voice of Joseph Stalin on the radio after the German invasion of the Soviet Union. June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. It almost destroyed the USSR. Instead, it was the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. And world-renowned military historian Antony Beevor will join us as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.